you will endure, will we go, but still I pray that you may know how rivers run, rivers flow, and if there ever should ever run dry, somewhere the rain will still fall, will still fall from the sky. I cross my heart and I hope to live just long enough that I can give it all to you, my darling one. Rivers flow and rivers run, my darling one. Rivers flow and rivers run.
Well, thank you everybody for coming along. Welcome to our third webinar in our series of nature, climate and soil friendly food production and land use. And that beautiful piece of music was chosen tonight by our speaker, Pete Iannetta. It was sung by Corinne Polwart and it was Rivers Run. So tonight's topic is legume-based food systems. And I'm very interested in this topic because on my survey journey around Scotland, surveying Scottish farmers and crofters, I encountered many fields of pristine peas and beans, the majority of which were destined for livestock feed. And I think the potential and the need to change this situation is huge. In the National Food Strategy that Henry Dimbleby put together, we learned that plant proteins use 150 times less land and emit 70 times less greenhouse gases than the equivalent amount of beef. But I'm going to turn this over to the expert. I'd like to introduce Dr. Pete Iannetta. He's based in the Agroecology Group at the James Hutton Institute, and amongst other things, they're involved in improving legume growing and consumption. So Pete works on, with a broad range of stakeholders, developing novel crops, plus cropping, processing, and marketing strategies, all very useful things. He's a principal investigator to the Scottish Government Strategic Research Programme on Novel Crops and Farming Practices. So as usual, the chat function will be off during our webinar. If you have questions for Pete, and I hope you do, please put them in the Q&A. If you prefer to ask them anonymously, that's fine too. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll pose your questions to Pete. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pete Iannetta. And I'll just let Pete share his screen.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
I'll share the screen now, and I shall just swap. I'm waiting for this view to. There we go. You should be able to see my slide now. Is that okay? I'm guessing that's okay, Rebecca.
Yeah, that's great, Pete.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sam. So I'm going to keep this really quite informal. The title I've chosen today is The Puzzle and Paradox of Legume-Based Food Systems. And I did my PhD a long time ago, over 30 years ago, at Dundee University, and I did my PhD on legumes and found that really it wasn't very popular in the UK for quite a long time, and spent the 10 years after my PhD not studying legumes. And most of the people I did my PhD with were from South America, Africa, largely, other parts of Asia. And yeah, it's only really the advent of a climate crisis and a financial crisis and a nutritional crisis and a biodiversity crisis very coming together that's really caused an upsurge in the interest of legumes. But let me just tell you a little bit about the James Hutton Institute. So I've been there for almost 30 years now, and so it's only in the last 20 years or so that I've been able to do to get back to my first love, which is legumes. But it started in 1921 with a focus on a group of crops here that doesn't include legumes. And then in 1930, the Macaulay Land Use Research Institute established up in Aberdeen. And the Scottish crop, the plant breeding station, which was then based in Edinburgh, moved to Dundee in 1951 and existed for 30 years there, adding pathology and soft fruit to the repertoire. So it's really only quite recently that legumes have started to feature in the mandate crops that are studied at the Scottish Crop Research Institute. And of course, in 1981, the Research Institute became the James Hutton Institute through a merger of the Scottish Crop Research Institute and the Macaulay Land Use. So we're around about 600 people, probably a little bit less. And this is the farmhouse that we started up in. I'm based in the Dundee site. We've got two main sites in Dundee and Aberdeen. And across various farms, we've got about, I believe, 2,000 hectares of farmland of various forms. And we do a lot of applied research. Now the Institute looks something like this. The original farmhouse is somewhere in the middle here. And we've actually got another, at the moment, one, I think collectively, it's probably just a little bit short of £100 million of development going on. And increasingly, we're becoming a place for companies interested in biotechnology, sustainable development to invest. So we're becoming a bit of a technology park as well. Now, the James Hutton Institute, you'll probably, many of you know who James Hutton is, but certainly when I heard, and many of my colleagues heard that the name was changing, a lot of people didn't know who James Hutton was, even within the Institute. But what a wonderful legacy he's left, and it's well worth looking into the history of his life and times. There's this, you might get this talk, I hope, as a PDF after the event, and anything you see in the PDF with an orange text is a clickable link that you can go to for more information. But essentially, James Hutton made that link between the geology of a place, its geochemistry, and he was able to relate that to system function and health. And that was quite a breakthrough. He also challenged the age of the earth and the religious powers that were around at the time weren't entirely happy with that, as you might imagine. But if you've got time, do have a read into this this summary of his work here. So I'm mainly funded, about 50% funded by the Scottish Government through RESAS, the Rural Environmental Science and Analytical Services Division of the Scottish Government, through rolling 5-year research programmes. And we work to inform Scottish Government sustainable development policies. We are one of several institutes, main research providers as they're called, and we're also supported by SASA. So we're quite a big bunch of people, and there's a lot of cooperation that goes on between all these agencies. So what I present today will certainly, you know, be reflective of some of the content seems to be missing here, but nevertheless, some logos seem to have gone. But these are the current projects I'm involved in: maximising protein yield. That's funded by the Hannah Dairy Research Foundation. This project has just started in November, which is an EU-China exercise. And also we've got this biodiversity sensitive farming. We're also looking at community food and health in island nations, and also realising dynamic chains for underutilised crops. But where we have a website for these projects, you can click on these links and find out a little bit more. So within the Institute, I work in the Agroecology Group, which is within Ecological Sciences Department. I'm not going to go into details about what agroecology is, but many of you will know that it's become a socio-political thing. It's far more than the study of the tilled system. And there are 10 elements to agroecology, and we're really looking to balance the ecological, social, and environmental aspects of systems. And increasingly, the group tries not to get too caught up in buzzwords or various recipes towards sustainability. And we rather try to focus on how we measure the system and that we understand our direction of travel and are able perhaps to better direct our direction of travel. The group was actually born out from a study that was done in the early 90s, which looked at the, it was at the time, it was the largest experimental release of GM crops, and we were involved with DEFRA and ADAS and various other agencies to monitor the impacts of GM cropping. But what emerged from that was this agroecological perspective on systems and developing capacities to measure not just system impacts, but system functions. So a lot of what I do centers around legumes. You all know what a legume is, but it still surprises me when I'm out and about around the world how many people do not know what a legume is. And I could probably talk at length. I won't do it now on some of the examples of people who really should know what a legume is and don't. And it's a little bit frightening to me. I think these things really need taught at school because they are, I think, a great vehicle for introducing particularly young people to carbon and nitrogen cycling. So excuse me if I'm patronizing you, but I'm going to go through this little schematic diagram of what is a legume. So a legume is a plant that takes the things that plants usually get, which is obviously air and water and sunlight. The air, the CO2, is fixed through photosynthesis. The photosynthesis in legumes is transferred to the roots. The roots have these bumps in the roots called nodules. The nodules can take the nitrogen from the air and fix it into biologically useful nitrogen that they can then pass back to the plant to empower growth. So, you know, simply, legumes acquire the nitrogen they need for growth, one of the most important, of course, elements limiting growth, via this process called biological nitrogen fixation, and therefore need no synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And you'll know yourself if you dig up a legume and look at the roots, you'll find these root nodules. That's a soybean in the middle, and on the left-hand side there's a lupin. You can see the root in the center and the nodule cortex, which is red because of the presence of leg-hemoglobin. It's a particular plant blood that grabs oxygen and helps drive the nitrogen fixation process. And on the far right is actually my PhD supervisor holding a very well nodulated faba bean from her garden. And we have talked at length about how well faba beans nodulate, particularly in manures that contain horse dung. That's another debate, perhaps for another time. But I'd love to see legumes, faba bean in the field, this well nodulated. I generally don't see it that well nodulated. So you'll know that legumes can empower, they provide multiple and complex ecosystem provisions and at low cost.
I think we lost you there, Pete. We'll give Pete a second. He said he might have Wi-Fi problems, so he might need to switch to his phone. So, yeah, I think we lost you there, Pete. Just give him a minute to see if he can get back on. I'll just give Pete another minute to get on. Let me see if I can email him. Just give Pete another minute or two to see if he can reappear. He did forewarn me that he might have problems with his Wi-Fi, in which case he would rejoin from his phone. So I'm just hoping that that happens. I've sent him a message. So I'll see how we get on. Here he comes. Hi, you're back. Can you hear us, Pete?
I can hear you now. So
Great, good. Welcome back.
I've never had that happen to me during a presentation before. My system just decided to crash.
The first time for everything.
So my apologies for that. I'll
No
just
problem.
dig up my presentation again. There we go. And okay, I think we were here. Oops. Oh dear. There we go. I think that's where we were.
Yeah, great stuff.
Right, okay, back to work. So I was saying that legumes, if well managed, can do a lot of things that many of you will already know about. Diversification of crop systems, biocontrol agents, improving soil. The list to me goes on, and we know about the provisions that they can make to systems. I get particularly annoyed when legumes are always referred to as nitrogen-free fertiliser or meat substitutes. And I always think it's worth emphasising that legume provisions are multiple and complex. And that's something I would encourage you all to do likewise. They stand to me apart in their own right and they're not substitutes for anything. And we also forget about the many non-nutritionals that legumes provide, not just to ourselves and other creatures, but also the farm system as well, soil and soil microorganisms in particular. This is a paper here that I published. I get a bit fed up as well about people who suggest linear solutions to problems. And I think we should be looking towards multifunctional solutions, and legumes certainly fall into that category. If we were to look at the range of things we can do, from vegetables, pulses, the oil-containing pulses, food feed industrial uses, forage legumes, which is various forms, cover crops, understories, livestock feed, soil improvers, manures. The list just to me goes on, and there's even people using forage legumes and woody legumes now for bioenergy and food. So more and more technology developing in the biorefinery arena. But yeah, of course, when we look at modern food systems, two seminal articles there that are well worth a look at. The data here is a little out of date, but the message is still highly relevant. We look at globalized trade networks, particularly for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, protein and carbohydrate. And I could talk about this slide for an awful long time, but the main points I want to make is that synthetic fertilizer use is still high. There's still a big import of it into Europe. Demand is set to increase. Reliance on oilseed meals are 74% imported in Europe, and soybean, 74% and 84% for soybean. Global meat demand is also set to increase, even if consumption falls in some of those countries that are not consuming meat. I still suspect many farmers will continue to produce meat for export markets, and particularly high quality meat. So we have a puzzle that how we best manage this globalized food system to protect the environment, deliver best nutrition, and also protect biodiversity locally and globally. This is a diagram I've adopted from this paper down here by Westerhoek in 2011, but to me, he called it the protein puzzle, but I call it the legume puzzle. And again, I could talk about this for a long time, but we have an issue of imported grain legumes driving largely livestock consumption. Most of what we produce is for feed, as you know, not food. Probably in Scotland, actual food production must be in the region of 5 or 10% of production, I would say. And we have this overconsumption of protein, human health costs, eutrophication, and so on and so forth. I mean, we could try to summarize this in this way. And I would probably summarize it with the three issues in red. The crop diversity is too low, that there is grain, legume, and oilseed import and use dependency, and also there's a lack of food system literacy and or opportunity to care. So that, to me, the paradox is we have grain, legume, and forage legume supported food and food systems in Europe and in the UK, but we actually don't have really food systems as such. And the benefits of legumes are forfeited because they're not homegrown. So that's that's a real issue. Moving on to how much legumes should we have in our system, I performed this study in 2016 as part of a project called Legume Futures, and we did essentially it was a meta-analysis of rotations that were and were not legume supported, and we found that at 50% legume inclusion, nitrogen fixation peaked, nitrogen fertilizer use was minimal, total nitrogen contribution to the system maximized, and our total N in the products was optimized. So 50% is a fair old inclusion. It's a long way away from where we are at the moment for most parts of Europe. Legume inclusion is on average between, depending on where you are in Europe, about 1 to 4% of the cropped area. And that was achieved at an equal balance of grain and forage legumes. Forage, cover crop or catch crop use was also common, and intercropping was common. So that 50% inclusion was achieved with this particular balance. We've also done studies focused on Scotland, and of course, where we see peas and beans used, they are used largely for animal production. Probably worthwhile mentioning at this stage, later in the talk, I'm going to be talking about the Scottish bean. And we grew some last year, and I was a bit dismayed to find that there were no processing facilities in Scotland that I could use to get the beans I'd grown to human food grade. I had to send them to England to be processed, and then they came back to me. But that's an aside for the moment. We can come back to that perhaps. But they're mainly used on mixed farms, of course. They're mainly used by farmers to support feed self-sufficiency. Hays are generally grown in rotations with more grass, beans in rotations with less grass and more winter wheat. But the really upshot of the study, and this was it here, it was led by the ex-head of agroecology, Jeff Squire, who's now retired, that at 20% legume inclusion, that's grain legume inclusion, which is about what we found with the previous study, 25%, that we could reduce synthetic nitrogen use by 20% and yield would not be compromised. I think it's also worthwhile mentioning that at the Institute, we have the Centre for Sustainable Cropping. It's a very clever platform that's managed by my colleague, Kathy Hawes. And it's an integrated cropping system. And we've been monitoring almost 300 system function indicators in that system for a long time. It's a stockless rotation. It's a 42-hectare platform, 6 fields. The fields have a split field design with conventional on one half or integrated farming on the other. But I really just wanted to emphasize here that that we can maintain yields with 40% less synthetic fertilizer use just through better optimizing of the organic residues that are there and in the local area. It's also, I'd like to mention the fact I just came across this paper just this week. It was published by colleagues at SRUC. I was intrigued by a sentence in the abstract. So I wanted to highlight it to you. Legume-supported rotations without livestock produce more protein, starch, and sugar per unit than those with livestock. I haven't dug too much into the background to this paper yet, but I'm sure it's something that many of the people listening here today will be interested in. So do go and have a look at that. But that was quite interesting to read. So the challenge I have as somebody who wants to see more legumes grown in the system is how do I do it in a largely arable system that's dominated with barley? The crop rotation in Scotland is barley, something else. And half of that is used for brewing or distilling. The other half of the barley is used for animal feed. But of course, we have to keep in mind that beer and whiskey contributes around £12 billion annually to the UK tax revenues. That's not a small amount. A lot of jobs rely on it. Scotland, the brand, relies on it. So how we do that in this context is something I grapple with daily. Also, another major industry in Scotland is aquaculture. And that represents a great opportunity, I think, for legumes, for pulse-based rotations. And if we were to grow pulses for aquaculture in Scotland, it would mean beans being grown 1 in 8 of the rotation, which isn't, sorry, about 1 in 8 in the rotation, which is, an 8 times increase in the cultivation, 1 in 12 crops in the rotation, which isn't really a frightening amount. But most salmon are fed on 70% of the diet now is vegetable protein, usually peas, beans, or soybean. But a challenge here is that the fish feed producers want to have higher protein concentrates, and fava beans are generally 28%. They can go a bit higher in organic rotations, possibly up to 32. There are some lines that are pre-commercial that can be pushed up, I think, eventually to around about 35 to 37% protein. But the difficulty is we don't have any fractionation facilities in Scotland, and quite often the components are worth more than the whole. But if we look at this particular project, Beans for Food, that looked at air fractionation, here you get beans, you dehull them, take the skins off, you mill them, you divide the kernels are then air fractionated. The starch goes lower in an air cyclone, and the protein goes higher, and you can remove the upper and lower layers of the airstream to create protein and starch concentrates. The protein concentrate we know works well in aquaculture. The hulls at the moment go to cattle and pet food, but actually they have a human health value as well. We have been playing with those in pastas and other foods as well, but that's another story. And the starch concentrate we found does feed pigs and poultry, but it's actually too expensive for animal feed. It doesn't quite stack up. So we had the idea of converting that starch into for brewing and distilling, and that worked. That would actually work quite well. And if we use brewing and distilling, these are natural infrastructures that we have in Scotland, we can actually eventually don't need to dehull or air fractionate. We can mill the beans directly and go straight to using the starch for alcohol. So after experiments using the starch concentrate, that's what we did. We moved to whole beans, and then did a life cycle analysis of gin and vodka made from peas. The kernels were distilled. The alcohol was used to make gin, and we found the potail, which is protein rich, was used to feed cows. And we found that in 12 of the impact categories, 12 of the 14 impact categories of the life cycle analysis, the pea gin was better than the wheat gin. And the other two actually there wasn't any difference between the two. There had a 12% global warming potential, and a Bicky farm which had no legumes on the farm now have a 20% grain legume cover, because our Bicky farm also has a distillery. The Nadar gin and vodkas have turned into best-selling products. The gin is very tasty. We've avoided land use change. We've avoided imported soybean and soybean products. We can also use fava beans in the process as well as peas, and we're now experimenting using the protein-rich potail for human food. These are the products here, and the Universities of Bangor and Trinity College Dublin also drove the LCA. If you want to go to the original papers, they are here. But it's been a great story. Our Bicky are now moving towards using intercropping as well. So not just using peas for their gin and vodka, but also using the barley from their intercrop, which is grown nitrogen-free, of course, into their whiskey products as well. So that's something that we'll hope to work a little bit more on downstream. And what we find is you can add a lot less barley when you're doing an intercrop as well. We have compared to a 100% seeding rate, when you recrop the peas and barley together at a 50% seeding rate, this is the same yield. We're not statistically different because the barley tillered more. And not only that, we had, of course, a 40% yield uplift, largely due to the peas. It is possible from other work we've done, we've seen that some farmers do choose to add a little fertiliser. It varies from farmer to farmer, just to push yields up and yield qualities up. Some farmers add 20 to 50% of the normal rate for barley, not as ammonium sulfate. And we're also working with field beans in this context. Field bean is not something we usually intercrop with barley, but because the Scottish bean has come on the scene, we've done now a couple of years of cropping barley and Henry Taylor Scottish bean together, and that's worked really well. So that's something we'll continue to work on and get those beans going for other food and drink products and the barley as well. But also I wanted to mention as well the work that the Hannah Dairy Research Foundation is sponsoring. We're finding at the moment that intercrops of grain legumes are working quite well together. Traditionally, it's been normal to mix a cereal with an intercrop, but we're finding more recently that actually if you mix a legume with a legume, you have some very good effects as well. So certainly we have a winter crop that's been sown at the moment, and that is a fava bean, pea, winter fava bean, winter wheat mixture. And in the spring, we're going to make another sowing of spring fava bean, spring barley, spring pea, and blue lupin. So understanding why the legume crops are featuring quite well is something we're also digging into. So those are just some of the reports we've had around the gin. It's been a great vehicle to wake people up to the issues of the need for natural nitrogen and natural nitrogen, carbon, and I'm getting my tongue tied. Natural cycles of nitrogen and carbon. I found various public communication events just empowered so much by having sustainable food and drink products to talk over. But in addition to the gin and the vodka, we have these this beer product as well. So this was we've had a series of beer products. This particular one has made it into Lidl. It's not sold there now, but it was sold for a very long time. It's done by Barney's Beer. And at the moment, this isn't just a beer story, of course, it's also a protein story, because the protein again drops out in the co-product. We've trialed that as an animal feed for chickens. It works very well. And the spent grain could be used for food and not just feed. Barney's is not producing it at the moment, but only because he's a small brewery and he's got commercially more better selling lines. And this raises the issue of a shortage, I think, of distributors and maybe even dedicated manufacturers of more sustainable green products. But we've recently had a couple of papers out. The first one, optimizing fava beans for brewing and distilling, just tells you about the method. And the second paper there is another life cycle analysis showing how well fava beans can operate with an integrated, with an optimized brewing technique and integrating that value chain with the animal feed value chain. But of course, the footprint would improve enormously again if we integrated that fava bean-based beer with a human food value chain. And that would be the next step. This is Kirsty here, who's driven all that work. It's an amazing young lady. She's the master distiller at Arbiki, very sustainably oriented. She's vegetarian. And we've done some great videos, so they're worth a dig into. I'm really proud of these videos. Increasingly, we're getting approached by companies, film companies, who are really keen to document the narratives around this transition that we're doing. Essentially being disruptive to existing food and feed chains and obviously beverage chains. And we've got the life cycle data to prove what we're claiming. But one of those has just received 2 Muse Awards, this Against the Grain video. So if you haven't seen those videos, do have a look. That's Kirsty in the middle of a graduation day, and she's keen to keep politely disruptive innovation going at Arbiki. Now, with regard to the Scottish bean, I'm refocusing some of my efforts on homegrown pulses for food. And something that's in my sights is the Great British Baked Bean, of which we consume over 1.5 million cans annually in the UK. And they're made from haricot beans, but we import around about 50,000 tonnes. And what people don't know is a lot of these beans, as are many soybeans actually, they're actually cultivated using synthetic nitrogen. As they're notoriously poor at biological nitrogen fixation. The good thing about common beans, haricot beans, is they can fix wherever you put them almost, but they might not fix very well because they're quite promiscuous with the rhizobia that nodulate, and they nodulate with lots of different types of rhizobia. So we're very lucky. It's a whole story in itself, actually. Talking about Henry Taylor's Scottish bean. He left the institute at the then Scottish Crop Research Institute almost 30 years ago, just before I joined the institute, and he was breeding beans at that time. He took them home to continue breeding them in his back garden. And later in his life, he started developing dementia. So he came to the institute and talked to me and gifted me, signed over the beans to the institute. And he had this bean that he referred to called the Scottish beans. He bred it to be low tannin, so it wasn't very bitter. So it's tasty, it's thin-skinned. It's got seeds which are more like peas than beans. The picture there on the far left is an intercrop that we've had of the Scottish bean with barley. It's got this lovely white flowers as well. So we developed some work with Aberdeen University, and we just did some physical characterizations of the bean. It's not very different from the haricot bean that's used to make baked beans, a little bit bigger, but not frighteningly bigger. If we look at the nutrient profiles, it's got a bit more energy, not surprisingly, but this is standardized per 100 grams. It's got a bit more protein, a bit less ash, a bit less moisture. That's changeable. Carbohydrates are a bit less, because the protein's more. Sugars are a bit less. You know, it's pretty similar, if not a little bit better, I would say, than the haricot bean. We're interested in polyphenols and antioxidant values of the Scottish bean. We compare it to the haricot. These are raw beans comparisons. We found that it's got quite a high polyphenol, total polyphenol content, and this usually relates to antioxidant levels. So these are just two methods to measure antioxidants, HORAC and FRAP, and particularly the FRAP-based method seems to show a lot more extractable antioxidants than the haricot bean. We then went on to try some baked bean trials, jarring rather than canning. And we developed the sauce recipe, which is a terrific sauce. I'm not going to tell you what the recipe is. I've been sworn to secrecy on that one. And the beans were soaked and rinsed and steamed and then cooked again. And we went on to product testing. I'll go into that a little bit later. We texture analysis. We redid the polyphenols and proximate analysis and whatnot. But essentially, the texture was pretty similar. There's big standard errors in these measures, but it's very similar to that. Cooked haricot bean was very similar to the Scottish bean in terms of its firmness and roughness. Proximate and fibers, again, these were generally declined after cooking, but of course, cooking often does that. Again, nothing frighteningly different between the baked bean and the haricot bean. This is the cooked product, this is the raw product, just to show you an impression of the extent of the declines in some of the nutritional contents. And again, the antioxidant potential was the same. TSB managed to retain its much higher antioxidant status, but again, there was a decline between the raw and the cooked material. And this just shows you the level of the reduction. But curiously, look for the HORAC method. We need to dig into this a bit more deeply. The cooked the Scottish beans fared quite well using the HORAC method. I don't know what that means functionally. I think we need to dig into that result a little bit more to check if it's real, and if it is real, then what might be the basis for it. Whether these translate through to improved nutritional values and physiological function would be another level of testing. It's also worthwhile mentioning that the TSB, whether you're looking at hardness or roughness of the bean in terms of product texture, this is the baked product, it uses half the amount of cooking time and therefore half the amount of energy. So there's probably, when we move on to life cycle analysis of this product, and we will, just like we did with the beer and with the gin and the vodka, we will, I think we'll find a good story with regards to energy use. So this is Rebecca and Viren, who help in Aberdeen University. Viren's now at the University of Sheffield. But we obviously the Scottish bean can be homegrown. It can be also intercrop with barley. It needs no synthetic nitrogen fertiliser, unlike the common bean. It offers higher protein and antioxidant values. It cooks quicker, and it's just as acceptable. We did taste tests, and people really liked it. Especially the sauce. So we're now working with various people to try and upscale and commercialize that product. We're working with the Gaia Foundation, Biogen and Tayside, Glasgow Locavor and Hodmedod's to see if we can realize a product in the near future. And we were working with, and if you want, there's a report online and a short video through this link here, and that was commissioned by the UK Food Farming Countryside Commission. I've also done an article for the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. So there's an article in the Geographer as well. So this is Henry Taylor here, and unfortunately he passed away in April 21. But his legacy is certainly living on. This is Ash, my research assistant, showing the beans here, and this is Kathy, the manager of the Centre for Sustainable Cropping, enjoying a plate full of the beans. So this was some of the test trialing that we've done with We Can Foods. We possibly would have gone to product last year, but the costs had gone up too much for Glasgow Locavore to do it. But we're revisiting that now with Hormadods, and it may be that we end up jarring instead of canning. But we'll see what develops. So I'm going to leave my talk there. I welcome questions. I just want to make a quick thanks to the people that work with me within the Ecological Food Systems Group. We're about 6 staff, and there's another 18 in agroecology as a whole. And I really quite rely on them, and of course PhD students. If you want to find me, you'll catch me on LinkedIn and on Twitter. I just thank the government for its funding, and welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Pete. That was a fascinating talk. Sam, do we have some questions in the Q&A?
Yes, we do. So we got a question from Norma Wallace. She says, I always see insistence on treating beans before planting. Is this required? And I think she's referring to inoculation.
I don't think well, it's certainly the studies we've done, and we looked UK wide. We found, generally speaking, that peas and beans don't need inoculation. However, there are some places where peas and beans don't perform well. We don't really know why they don't perform. So we've developed a technique for it's a molecular technique to look for how much rhizobia is in the soil and what the diversity of those are, and the extent to which those rhizobia in the soil can nodulate peas and beans. And in 80% of the fields we look at, we can find a correlation between yield and the amount of rhizobia in the soil, nodulating rhizobia in the soil for peas and beans. So where there is a problem, 80% of the time, it might be related to rhizobia levels. But also another thing I've found is that when I intercrop peas and beans, where I add a commercial inoculant, it often improves the vigor and yield of the legumes, and sometimes the cereal that grows with the legumes too. So I know that's an incomplete answer. It can benefit crops in some occasions. The other thing that's worth mentioning is we've been doing some work identifying elite rhizobia. So we isolate rhizobia from root nodules, from the soil. We trap rhizobia, and we found that in ex situ environments, this is amazing to me, we can find a 12-fold difference in growth depending on the rhizobia that you apply. So there's a tremendous difference in the capability of these rhizobia empowering plant growth. It doesn't manifest itself as a 20-fold difference in the field because the field's a more complex environment. But we do see enhancements at times. So sure, if you've got a problem, you could test your rhizobia levels, or you could be working with compost that might have elevated levels of nodulating rhizobia. There's different means of increasing the amount of rhizobia you have in your soil. So yeah, I could talk about that at length as well. It's another whole research area. But generally speaking, if you're on a sandy soil, you'll have a tougher time, I think, than a loamy soil with legumes, for different reasons. Okay.
Yeah, great. I've got a question from Joe Kiddle. We've got several questions in one. First of all, was the Scottish bean in the trials you had, were they grown organically?
I wouldn't say they were grown, well, they have been grown organically. Last year we sowed about 350 kilograms out in a local organic farm.
Oh, sorry, it was veganically as well. So
veganically, no, they haven't been
Yeah.
grown veganically yet. If somebody has a vegan system they want to trial them on, terrific. Let's give it a go. But no, we trialed them on an organic system, and we when I grow them at the institute, I trial them on an integrated system. I generally aren't applying anything at all to them actually, unless the farm staff really pressure me to. So generally I grow them without any additions at all, and they grow reasonably well. I mean, Henry bred these on in his back garden. To me, they still need a bit of refinement. The Cetona seem to like them, which isn't not Cetona, sorry. Yeah, no, that's right. The Cetona weevil, sorry, Dusly. I was getting Cetona and Brookhead mixed up. I haven't seen Brookhead on it yet, but I have seen Cetona seems to like it quite a lot. It doesn't really affect its yield. We were sowing it, I think, too thinly. We were sowing it at 40 plants per square meter, which is a standard rate for fava bean. But because it's dwarf, I think, and so the yield was consequently about 2.5 tons-ish per hectare. But I think we could be sowing it like a pea, sowing it about 80 plants per hectare or more, and increasing the yield to something that's more akin to what we'd see, of a typical big, normal spring fava bean. So I think there's more work to be done looking at the row spacing times plant density arrangement for common bean. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They also add what's the irrigation and the soil requirements for growing the Scottish bean? Normal,
just as you would for fava bean. Nothing different, nothing special. I think with any fava bean crop, whether it's dwarf or not, is you want to be very careful with the plant around flowering time. And if there is any risk of it being too dry, then operating in a way to ensure you don't get flower abortion or early pod abortion would be good. If you can irrigate, do. Particularly at that sensitive transition phase between vegetative and reproductive growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And last of the ads, have there been any trials using a agroforestry approach?
No. Again, I would welcome that. I'm a big believer in agroforestry. I've made a few trips down to Wakelands when it was operating under Martin Wolf. So I'm a big believer in agroforestry-based systems, and we'd love to see much more of them across the UK.
Great. Just got another question from Sandy Stevens, who asks, person says, amazing session, thank you, Pete. You mentioned considering legumes in their own right, rather than seeing them as a substitute, as is often the case in the UK. Why do you think this is the case here in the UK, despite our obsession for baked beans, and how might we bring more awareness around the benefits of this food source?
I mean, I think the beauty of baked beans is they're convenient. I think a lot of people are genuinely quite busy making ends meet, and I think one of the terms I used in one of my slides was, I find that people care, and they care passionately about the environment and their health, but they're operating in a firefighting mode, I would say. So to me, one of the beauties of baked beans is it's something that particularly a parent, can pick up and slap on a plate. I mean, they're also sweet, and that makes them, I think, attractive to young people. But I do think beans of any form could be sold in more different sauces. I love, if I look at Ethiopian cuisine, they've got something that's equivalent to a dal that's favoured with their local herbs and spices. But it's essentially a dal. It's a pea powder, whole peas milled to a powder, and then cooked up in a sauce. Now, we used to have something like that in Scotland years and years ago, peas meal. We didn't go as far as flavouring it with local herbs and spices. Maybe if we would have, it would have been more attractive to eat. But some of these things were embedded in our culture historically. I can look at books from the 1700s where people were cooking extensively with homegrown peas and beans, even brewing with peas and beans and distilling with peas and beans. These things were grown together, cooked together, whether you fed animals with them or made soup with them or brewed with them. So, but I think it's to me it's the ease which they can be used. That's the underpinning the success. And obviously, a lot of people when they eat food want a liquid with their food, a sauce of some form. So the beans bring the sauce with them, and I think that the sauce becomes the vehicle for the beans. And I think a lot of people as well are largely ignorant of the value chain, unfortunately. And this is true for whiskey as it is for peas and beans. Kids at school are taught about a healthy diet, which is quite right. They're taught that they need, fiber and carbohydrates and protein and whatnot. But they're not taught about the efficiency with which different foodstuffs are created or how they're created. And I wish they would say more about that. This is barley. Barley can be grown organically with organic inputs and what they are. It can be a grown convention. Let them know a little bit about how different the cropping systems and processing methods are used to get the food on their plate. I think it's only fair that the kids are taught that food arrives on their plate with different levels of efficiency and with different consequences to nitrogen and carbon cycling. And maybe the attractiveness of baked beans or any other product would be increased if if that awareness was there.
Yeah, and then Sandy also mentioned at the end that for them, Spain comes to mind as a sort of culture where games are more celebrated and more integrated in our national dishes.
But even if I looked at distillers, it's curious. Somebody will say to me, just an example. We won't accept there's a belief that, for example, people said barley was made with whiskey. That whiskey was only ever made with barley, but that's not true historically. They say it's traditional to make whiskey with barley. Well, actually, no, it's traditional to make whiskey with anything that you can distill. And there's lots of evidence from 16 and 17. So it's more traditional actually to use peas and beans in distilling than it is to use, and I hear people saying, peas and beans were never really meant to grow in Scotland. I've had that said to me. So, well, but you've got no problem with potatoes. Potatoes come from South America. And you find lots and lots of these contradictory statements. I meet distillers who would say, we can't accept an intercrop product because its qualities would be too low, and we've proven that it's actually higher alcohol yielding than the normal barley varieties, and that actually low barley with low nitrogen can distill better than barley with higher nitrogen. If it's been bred for distilling, it's bred for distilling, and it distills well. So the same is true for a lot of these. But when you come to legumes, what I am jealous of when I look to wheat and barley is that we don't have the diversity of types within faba bean. So I would like to see in the future faba bean grown perhaps for different purposes. Some for food, some for distilling, whatever it happens to be. Some for brewing, is in the ways that we have bread, wheat for bread making, and whatnot. Barley for human food, and a different barley for brewing, and maybe a different barley again for distilling. Peas have quite a range of types, quite an exciting range of types. I'd love to see the same range of types for faba bean, but that would require more breeding diversity. And shut me up sometime, just tell me to stop, otherwise I'll stop.
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more question. It's from Lawrence Candy. What is the best methods for weed control when growing pulses organically or veganically?
Crop density. Obviously ploughing, if you're growing them organically, if you're ploughing, that's good to get your weeds under control. Weed control is always a difficult one. But from my point of view, I talk to organic farmers, and it's really interesting what they say. Of course, they want less weeds, especially when you've got a dwarf crop. And this is dwarf faba bean, so the weeds can quickly get up to the same height as the crop. So the main thing is to get the beans established into a good bed with lots of soil moisture, so that there's no. Pulses are quite big seeds, and if you plant them whenever they're dry, they're not going to come up quickly. The weeds will get up before them and will stay ahead of them. So I would say, even if you can, try priming your seeds, hydropriming your seeds, soaking them before you sow them. And that will, and sow the crop densely again at that 80 plants per square meter instead of 40. And that will help suppress the weeds naturally as well. Other than that, then you're looking at technologies of weed control, and there are some fancy things out there at the moment, whether it's using steam or electric currents or robots of various forms, but it depends on your size of your operation as to how you want to, whether you want to go down those routes. But sow densely into a soil bed with good moisture content, and make sure there's good soil seed contact. Make sure that soil is rolled, compressed.
Great. We've got lots of thank yous in the comments as well for your presentation and your answers.
Okay, well, we're giving some beans out to people that want to trial them. At the moment, it's not a recognised variety. There's still some work that we need to pursue with the Scottish bean. It wouldn't qualify for what we call DUS qualifications. That's distinct, uniform, and stable. We need to qualify for those criteria to be a registered variety, but that's not stopping us charging ahead with it. It's about 3% of the population. Faba beans are outbreeding, so they're quite a diverse community of individuals. They're not fixed like an inbred wheat. So about 3% of the population is a slightly taller type with a purple flower. And I don't mind that, but it is a problem when you want to go for DUS testing. And that tall type is actually even earlier than the main bean. So what I'd like to do is a bit more work, seeing if I can get lines of single seed descent to make the lines pure. But it's not essential. And the fact you have that little bit of other bean there doesn't really stop you growing it. Could even be a good thing. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Pete. That was fantastic. And you touched on my question there, which is if there are farmers listening who are interested in growing the Scottish bean, how far away are we from them being able to, do that and have a route to market, have a route to processing?
I've certainly given them out under material transfer agreement for non-commercial use at small scales, and we've got another agreement for people who want to pursue it at larger commercial scales. Right. And it's just so we can keep control of the of where it is, and we'd hate to see it exploited unfairly.
Yeah, thank you. And it's great to hear that Hodmedod's is involved too, because we purchase a lot of British grains, pulses, and seeds, legumes.
They are brilliant. Hodmedod's, like we're a fantastic company, just doing amazing things.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Well, thank you so much for your talk today. Sam, do you have our last slide to pop up there? Just to let you know that Pete's talk will be available on online at the same link that you registered for the talk. So that should be up tomorrow. So there's so much great information in the slides. If you want to look at that again, you can go to stockfreefarming.org/beyond the possible and be able to hear the recording. To let you know that next week we've got an exciting presentation coming up on Tuesday. We have Robert and Michelle Sullivan talking about their horticulture business. Also to let you know, next Thursday's presentation unfortunately has been cancelled due to some unforeseen circumstances, but we will be having our talk with Robert and Michelle Sullivan on Tuesday. There's the link to sign up. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them to contact@stockfreefarming.org and we will forward those on to Pete for you. Once again, thank you so much, Pete, for tonight. It's very informative. And thanks everybody for coming along, and we hope to see you next Tuesday evening for our next talk. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Rebecca, Sam, and thanks everybody else who's listening in. Cheers.
Yeah, have a great evening.
Thanks,
Bye-bye now.